I'm going to talk about Thatcher's role in apartheid. And there's been quite a lot of nonsense, I think, spoken about Thatcher's role, generally, especially her role as a champion of freedom, democracy and liberty. And I think of all the stuff that's been spoken, this has really wound me up most. Especially Barack Obama, who described her as the great champion of liberty. I think it's quite interesting if you look at the paper from the 1990 that she was apartheid's last friend. So I'd like to start off in looking at her role in apartheid just by describing apartheid for the comrades who may, just a snapshot because I've only got 8 minutes, for the comrades who may be too young to remember some of the struggles that we had against apartheid. I was born in Cape Town, and my first recollection of apartheid and its horrors was as a child, being turfed out of the area that we lived for generations under the Group Areas Act. Loads and loads of communities were dumped in rural areas, and basically some of them, their baggage was carried along with them. But the other aspects that I remember as a child about apartheid and grew up with was the extremes of wealth. There was mass exploitation of black workers who were paid an absolute pittance, having been removed from the areas where they'd been lived, dumped into rural areas, and then forced to come back to work in white areas or in mines, living in absolutely dreadful squalor. At the same time, the white communities lived in the most enormous wealth. I think in the 70s or 80s, they were described as having a standard of living higher than Sweden. And I think very quickly, I will go on about it, is one of the quotes from Verwoerd, the Prime Minister in the 70s, really describes his attitude towards black people. He said, "There's no place for the African in the European community above the level of certain forms of labour. What is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when he cannot use it in practice?" So this is the kind of government of which Thatcher was a friend. In 1973, following the killing of 700 young people in the Soweto uprising, and the murder in detention of black conscious activists like Steve Biko, there was an increasing demand, both internationally and from the working class in South Africa, for greater economic sanctions. And I'm sure everybody's read about Thatcher's position on sanctions against South Africa. We know also that Dennis Thatcher had investments in South Africa. We know that actually Mark Thatcher did an internship in South Africa, and they were friends with Botha. But the key reason why Thatcher opposed economic sanctions was because in the 80s, Britain had 50% of the foreign investment in South Africa. On the face of it, she argued that sanctions would harm the black working class. We don't believe that. Thomas Mkorbi of the ANC in the 80s said this: "Those who say that the economic embargo against South Africa would hit South African blacks, most should recall the words of the late Chief Lutulu, who said, 'If a temporary hardship is a way of removing a permanent suffering, it is a price we are gladly prepared to pay.'" In fact, Thatcher defied loads and loads, hundreds and thousands of anti-apartheid demonstrators, and invited P.W. Botha to Chequers. He was the first South African Premier to visit the UK since they left the Commonwealth in 1961. We also know the Tories and Thatcher's, we've read about it, comments on the ANC, a typical terrorist organisation. But also, disgustingly, in the 1980s, the Young Conservatives wore badges saying "Hang Nelson Mandela." And Tali Tambo, the son of the former ANC president Oliver Tambo, said to the Guardian, I thought it was quite amusing, it's quite likely that when Margaret Thatcher reaches the pearly gates, the ANC will boycott the occasion. We could never call her one of the champions of the liberation struggle. So I think it's quite clear what Thatcher's attitude towards economic sanctions and towards the ANC. So all the nonsense and gumph that is written about her role in securing Nelson Mandela's release is just that, nonsense. What was key, I think, in securing the release of Nelson Mandela and bringing the apartheid government to the table was, in the 80s, a rise of a militant trade union and working class movement in South Africa. In the early 80s, the Black Trade Union was the fastest growing trade union in the world. And when COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, was formed in 1985, it had 450,000 members. It was a politicized union. It demanded one person, one vote. It demanded educational reform. It demanded the release of political prisoners. And at the same time, there was the most massive increase in strikes and stayaways in South Africa. Strikes went up from 101 in 1979 to 1,048 in 1987, in the middle of a state of emergency. The fact that actually hundreds of activists were murdered by the South African police, and 26,000 people were detained during that period. That heroic struggle, including stayaways, which were, I think they're amazing stayaways, like political general strikes, where people just said, we're not going to go out because the police are going to attack us, we're going to stay at home, and, you know, and strike in that way. So I think it was the heroic and powerful working class that forced the apartheid government to release Mandela. And, you know, like Quinton Hogg said, the start of the welfare state, we must give them reform or they will give us revolution. Or as the clerk said in last night's Evening Standard, I don't know if anybody read it, we must adapt or die. So I think this is rather than Thatcher's role in releasing Mandela being, you know, her role was effectively, I think, to encourage her cronies to open the door, not to a revolutionary change in South Africa, but actually to act as a bloc. This revolutionary change at that point, at the end of the struggle of the working class, would have transformed the lives of the mass of black people in South Africa, not just the few. Thatcher instead, with the support of her cronies, apartheid cronies, means that actually we in South Africa got something called a negotiated settlement, which, though it got rid of most of the political and social aspects of apartheid, for most of the population, little has changed. You know, there's still, in South Africa today, foreign capitalists still remove loads of profits unhindered, and unemployment and inequality is worse than at the end of apartheid. 6 out of 10 people of working age in South Africa have no job at all, and the pressure of low wages adds to the cost of caring for people. But, and I'll end here, the confidence of that working class and the part that it played in overthrowing apartheid has meant that since 2005, South Africa has experienced most strike days per capita than any other country, and urban unrest is greater than anywhere else in the world. And this was absolutely and powerfully demonstrated with the Marikana strike. So this is our legacy, and this is our future.